Hi there. We're going to talk about how successful vineyard problem diagnostics begin by accounting for all the details. Vines are living organisms, and as such, they are susceptible to biotic factors like pests and diseases and abiotic factors like environmental conditions, just like a human. When you visit a doctor's office, the doctor will ask you a series of open-ended questions and collect detailed information like, how long have you felt this way? Where is your pain? Do you have a family history of this illness? Just like doctors using a systematic approach to diagnosing problems in a patient, we, as grape growers or viticulturists, need to do the same within our vineyards. When a growth problem arises in a vineyard, it's important to take a systematic approach to understanding and identifying the underlying issues. Good diagnostic techniques rely on collecting detailed information, recognizing patterns, and considering factors at the landscape, block, and vine scale. This video will help you develop a systematic approach to diagnosing problems. We will start our diagnostics lesson at the landscape scale. One of the most important factors to consider at the landscape scale is topography. Are the abnormal vines located at a particularly low or high point in the landscape? In low-lying areas, cold air can collect, resulting in vine damage in both the winter and the spring. During the winter, young vines in particular are susceptible to cold injury, which is exacerbated by dry soil conditions, but vines of all ages are susceptible to spring frost events. Poor drainage and waterlogging can also be a factor in low-lying areas. Alternatively, during heat events, hot air can collect in low-lying areas with poor airflow and can damage ripening fruit. Vines that are trained low to the ground can suffer radiant heat damage during high temperature and low relative humidity events. Vines located at high points or exposed areas can have their own set of issues, including shallow soils with low water holding capacity that can limit root growth and exposure to high winds and solar radiation. Other landscape factors that can affect vine growth include riparian habitat, trees, and roads. Riparian and ornamental habitats can harbor pests or diseases. Mature trees with large canopies and extensive root systems compete with vines for light, water, and nutrients. They can also harbor pathogens such as armillaria. Dust from unpaved roads can exacerbate spider mite populations, and products used to reduce dust, such as magnesium chloride, can run off and cause toxicity symptoms, often over multiple growing seasons. It's important to consider all of the landscape factors we talked about and determine whether they could explain patterns of poor vine growth. Pause the video here to go over the questions or notes for this section. Continue on when you are ready. Next, we'll consider patterns of abnormal growth that may emerge at the block scale. First, consider whether the affected vines are limited to a single block or whether they are found across multiple blocks. Often, abiotic factors such as hail damage will be visible across multiple blocks, whereas nutrient toxicities or deficiencies tend to be limited to a smaller area based on soil factors or plant material like rootstock characteristics. If an error occurred with the pesticide application, the affected area will closely follow rows or sprayer tank volumes. Here are some helpful questions you can ask yourself. Is there random or regular distribution of affected vines? Are affected vines in patches or clumps? Is it along the edges? Is it in certain rows? Is it in one block or all blocks? Are the vines vigorous or weak? Are any phenological markers such as bud break later than usual? Are leaves of multiple ages or orientations affected? Is it in a certain variety of grape? Is it a certain rootstock? Were they all planted the same year? Pause the video here to go over the questions or notes for this section. Continue on when you are ready. Finally, we'll consider patterns of abnormal growth at the vine scale. This involves looking closely at the affected vines and characterizing the distributions of symptoms throughout the vine. Is a certain section of the canopy, like lower, mid, or upper canopy leaves, affected, or are symptoms limited to leaves of a similar age? For example, potassium deficiency typically manifests in older tissues because it's a mobile nutrient, whereas boron deficiency is typically seen in younger leaves since boron does not move from older to younger leaves. Is the root system healthy? Does the graft union appear strong? If canopy growth is stunted, pay close attention to the root system and the graft union. If they are compromised, the movement of water and carbohydrates can be restricted, affecting vine growth. Here are some helpful questions you can ask yourself. When did vine symptoms begin to appear? Did you have a similar problem last year? Are there more or less infections compared to the previous year? It's important to take detailed timings of symptoms and to monitor spread, if any. Once you have studied the distribution of symptoms at the landscape, block, and vine scale, you are ready to assess whether biotic or abiotic factors are causing the abnormal growth. Although biotic factors are widespread, it's good to keep the possibility of an abiotic problem open unless the testing panel indicates otherwise. We'll begin by considering potential abiotic issues which typically arise due to weather or farming practices. Is there mechanical damage to the vines? Consider not only tractor damage, but also potential damage from weed whackers or other implements used to drain vines. Is there a pattern of affected vines that is consistent with spray damage? Is there a pattern at the edge of a road or drive area that could be related to magnesium chloride runoff or damage related to radiant heat from the pavement? Could lack or surplus of nutrients explain the symptoms? Are the vines located near the leach field of a septic tank? And if so, have you checked with the occupants of the building to see if their cleaning practices have recently changed? Have there been any temperature extremes, whether high or low? Has it been a particularly dry or wet year? Are there any symptoms in the surrounding non-vine vegetation? For example, in areas with poor drainage, if the vines are stunted, the cover crop may also grow poorly. Or if there was a misapplication of an herbicide, surrounding vegetation may also exhibit toxicity symptoms. Here's a review of abiotic questions you can ask yourself. Pause the video here to go over the questions or notes for this section. Continue on when you are ready. Next, we'll consider a biotic explanation for the affected vines. Again, it's important to make note of what kind of damage you see and where it is on the vine. For example, some clues can be gained by looking at the characteristics of foliar symptoms. However, there are many biotic and abiotic causes for red leaves, so it may be more important to consider patterns of distribution and timing of symptom development, as well as relying on laboratory assays to determine whether a pathogen is involved. Do you see any evidence of animals or insects? Excrement can be a clue to insect damage. Honeydew is produced by phloem-feeding insects, and caterpillars have characteristic feces and feeding damage. Did the damage occur near a tree line and follow a high wind event in the spring? Often caterpillars will be blown from mature trees onto vines, and incapable of returning to the preferred habitat, they opportunistically feed on vines. Gophers or other vertebrates may leave chewing damage, and turkeys may feed at the edges of forested areas and select low-hanging berries, leaving higher clusters untouched. Tree hoppers girdle petioles and tender stems, inducing reddening of leaf tissue above the girdle. Please be mindful to the time of year when foliar symptoms are present and which pests are more likely to be present at that time. For example, diseases that show prominent foliar symptoms in late summer and early fall include leafroll and red blotch. Whereas Pierce's disease can stem vines in the spring, cause berry shrivel from pre-veraison onward, and developing leaf scorch symptoms in the late summer. Chronic problems associated with trunk pathogens like Eutypa may result in season-long stunted growth and lack of fruit development. Though looking for patterns in your vineyard is important, laboratory assays may be necessary to determine whether a pathogen is present. Here's a review of biotic questions you can ask yourself. Pause the video here to go over the questions or notes for this section. Continue on when you are ready. We hope that the approach to diagnosis outlined in this video will give you the insights you need to develop a solution for your vineyard. Whenever you observe poorly performing vines, carefully consider pattern distribution at the landscape, block, and vine scale as a potential explanation for your problem.